Leanne from the Chesapeake Center. Today we are talking about dyslexia with Dr. Robert Chase from our center. Dr. Chase is a psychologist with over 30 years of experience in the field. He has a background in comprehensive testing and assessment for ADHD and learning disabilities. And so we are thrilled to have him with us today to talk about this learning disability that sometimes is often misunderstood. So thank you, Dr. Chase, for joining us.
Sure, absolutely. I couldn't go outside anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So might as well come and chat with me today. So our topic, we're going to break down just an overview of dyslexia. So we'll talk a little bit about the different types, also some signs of what to look for, and then we do have some resources for you as well. So we have a lot of information to cover, and if you have any questions, please feel free to comment below. We will try our best to get to them. If not, we will be sure to respond after the fact. And last, if you haven't already, please be sure to like and follow our page so that you stay in the loop for future topics. So without further ado, Dr. Chase, what is dyslexia? Let's start there.
Sure, good place to start. Well, dyslexia is a specific type of learning disability, and specifically it's a learning disability in reading and the flip side of reading, which is spelling, but we'll mostly talk about reading. So dys, D-Y-S in front of anything, is the clinical term for basically an impairment or a problem with lexia, lexicon, for printed words. So dyslexia, difficulty learning how to read. And it has nothing to do in general with intelligence. In fact, that's learning disability is kind of the definition of that despite having the requisite intelligence and all the other abilities that the person should be able to learn this skill, in this case reading, they're having trouble doing that.
So are there different types of dyslexia? We hear the word dyslexia and I don't really understand it. So I'd love to know a little bit more if there are different types and what the backgrounds are for that.
Absolutely. There are actually different types, although I would say easily 85% of people with dyslexia probably have this one type that we're going to talk about first. Dyslexia, any learning disability really, but dyslexia is caused by some information processing problem that usually originates with some part of the brain that is responsible for doing that kind of information processing. Now, there are three main types of dyslexia, and they pretty much correspond to problems with these three, or combination of the types of processing issues. So the first one that we'll talk about, and the main one, is something called phonological dyslexia, okay, which specifically is difficulty with the brains being able to process the sounds in words. So processing sounds as they relate to words, and therefore ultimately how to print those words letter by letter. Okay? And let me just explain this. So once a word is heard by the ear, right, it goes into the brain, and in the brain it's processed, it's analyzed. So let's go actually there to slide 1, which will really demonstrate what this phonological processing is really about. So let's see, with slide 1, actually let's go to I guess the next slide. It's the yes. Okay. So with this, this is based on a test of phonological processing that you can do with young children, but it's a very good way to demonstrate what this skill is, and it's really the main skill in learning to read. So let's say we use the different colored blocks. Each of those little squares, let's say, is a different color block. And you say to the person, you put out 2 blocks. In this case, I guess it looks gray, and maybe the next one is yellow. And you say, this would be it. And you point to the gray block and say, that's the it sound. And you point to the yellow block and you say, that's the t sound, right? So it, t, right? So if that's it, you say to the person, show me at, change it into at. and you demonstrate it. So they're realizing the first sound is changed. The I, which is a phoneme. Each individual sound in a word is called a phoneme. So the I has changed to A. So they would demonstrate that they understand this by changing the first block to a different color. And so if that's it, then the next one next to it is at. You change the first sound. Then you say, okay, so if that's at, and now we'll go down to the second row. If that's at, okay, make it bat. Now, what you're looking for is, does the person hear that there's now 3 sounds? Or do they just hear at as one sound? But hopefully they hear at as 2 sounds, a and t blended together. Now it's bat. Do they hear that there's been a third sound that's been added? And where in the sequence is it? Well, it's the first one. So if they put another block in front, bat, all right? And then if you said, well, if that's bat, show me but. Hopefully they can hear that the middle sound is changed and they would change the color, and so on and so forth, right? So this is a way of saying, is that part of their brain being able to break down the sound they hear into its individual sounds, not only what sounds, where in the word are those sounds, and we can even start to substitute one out for the other, or we can change the order, we can blend them, and we can take them apart. And this is phonological awareness, phonological processing. And it is the most important part of learning to read. Now, why is that? Well, the first task in learning to read is learning the alphabet, the alphabetic code, letter sound correspondences, right? A is for apple, the letter A, this is a picture. It's just a shape that the child's never seen before. They already know the sounds of the language. They already have an oral vocabulary. But now you're showing them these strange written shapes and saying, this stands for these sounds. And each individual letter has its own sound, and then later you get fancy and you do blends and you say these combinations of letters make other sounds. But here's the point. If, because of problems with phonological processing in the brain, you have a weak understanding of what sounds are in each word and where they are, how much more difficult is it going to be to then learn how to associate these sounds that you're not quite sure of with all these different symbols, right? So you need good phonological processing to learn how to sound words out, which is the very basis of learning to read, right? So you can see where if you have weak phonological processing, it's going to really interfere with just that first, most basic ability to learn letter sound relationships and even be able to sound words out. Now, if we go to, I guess maybe it's slide 1, now the brain, the picture of the brain that was up before. Great. The red area on that slide is the part of the brain on the left side of the brain that does phonological processing. So if you say, where in the brain does this take place? It takes place in that red area. And it's in that area, and usually this is neurodevelopmental, maybe it's genetic, it could be for various reasons, but the cells, as they connect to other cells in that area, and then they connect to other networks that connect to other parts of the brain, there are some just differences in how the cells in that area of the brain in general, how it develops. And because of that, there are problems with doing this, which should be a natural skill that develops in young children.
So that would be normal processing, would be able to pull that and say B, or the B sound is its own, and then you're adding A and then adding T. So for someone with dyslexia in this type, what do they see that as, or what do they process that as?
Right. But it's not even what they see it as. And I want to be really specific about that, because one of the common misconceptions, most people think is that dyslexia is basically a visual-based reading problem. There are many jokes, dog is God, and, kind of backwards. Dyslexia is backwards. In fact, that's generally speaking, like I said, a fallacy. It's more of a language-based learning disability, because the issue is with this phonological processing of the sounds of words. Now, we will talk, actually in just a minute, that there are some visual perceptual aspects. And again, vision is what the eyes do. It's, can you see clearly? Do you have clear vision? Do you have, or double vision or blurry vision? That's sight. If the eyes give the brain perfectly good visual information, the brain then has to process that information to make sense out of it. And that's when we talk about information processing. That word is bandied about a lot. We're talking about what the brain is doing with the information that the eyes, or the ears, or the sense of touch, any of our senses, when it feeds it to the brain, does the brain, like a computer, analyze it and make it make sense? So people with dyslexia, it's usually not a visual thing. They see fine. And the second type we're actually going to get into now is more about problems with a particular part of the brain that can process and memorize the visual representation of letters. That'll be clear when we go into it. So, I talked about that the second type of dyslexia is what we call surface dyslexia. Sometimes it's called orthographic dyslexia. And what it involves is this. Once somebody sounds words out, letter by letter, sound by sound, and they do it, probably hundreds of times, just by the sheer repetition of it and familiarity that gets created there. Over time, when they start to see that word that they've sounded out and decoded so many times, it will become very familiar. And as that happens, they'll start to store what that word or parts of the word look like in a particular part of the brain. And if we go again back to that brain slide, this part of the brain that gradually starts to store memories of what words look like is that green area down at the bottom, which is sometimes informally called the word form area. So as you read, you see that word so many times, yes, you start to sort of visually memorize it. And when I say not only words, but word forms, let me also show what I mean by that. So actually here, if we go to, I guess, slide 3, I want to make a quick point on that, all right? So this is an idea of blends, how in the English language, of course, each letter has its sounds, but then once kids sort of learn that, you pull the rug out from under them a bit and you say, well, and when you put the certain letter combinations together, they make a whole different sound. So in this case, the kid learns that, let's say, the letter P is P and the letter H is H. Okay? Now you have the nerve to put them together and say, and PH next to each other makes this whole other sound. And they need to learn that. Now, it's one of the more difficult languages in that respect. Yes, we're fortunate in that respect. But what I show, and actually, if we can put that slide back up again for a second, what I'll show kids or parents is one way to help them understand, well, wait a minute, how could that be? Is this idea if I put, let's say, the P under a box, and the H under a triangle, and I say to the kid, well, what's that? I point to the box. They say it's a square. What's that under the H? They say it's a triangle. And then I'll point to the thing on the right, and they'll say, what's that? Normally they'll say that's a house. I'll say, yeah. I said, but why didn't you say that it was a triangle on top of a square? Well, I mean, technically, I guess it is, but because, that, yes, right. And just like those two things, when formed together, make this whole other thing perceptually, the P and the H does too. So that blending is we're beginning to well, appropriately enough, blend phonology, which is the sounds, with what it looks like. Now, just to bring this home, if we can go to the next slide, and now, after you read words many times, thank you, when I said you memorize the whole word, if they're short words, you might recognize it on sight. But there's way too many words in the English language to recognize each of them is like a separate object. Like you look at a lamp and say that's a lamp, and then you look at an orange and say that's an orange. Imagine trying to visually memorize, I mean, hundreds of thousands of words. So here's what the brain does. It can remember parts of words that are meaningful and repetitive. So, for example, it learns word roots, the main part of the word, and prefixes, which is the first few letters at the beginning or the end. So, as an example here, right? Trans, whether we know it or not, trans means across, right? And fur is actually, I'm having trouble with my feed for a second. Able, capable, of course. So transferable is able to transfer or move across. But the point is, we learn trans, we see that and the brain would read that as transferable, and it would probably skip almost like a rock on a lake, skimming across a lake. It'd be trans and fur and able, and like it would move like probably 3 quick scans, then say transferable. And if you took that able and you put at the end of another word like adore, adorable, so it starts to say, oh, I can switch these things out, and reading becomes much more fluent that way. So the importance of building up this word form area is that as that starts to build with more experience, you can start to recognize words or word parts on sight, and that's when reading becomes automatic and fluent. Because if our whole lives we had to sound every word out, letter by letter, sound by sound, which is what you need to do to start learning to read, but obviously reading would be a very slow, laborious process. So more accomplished readers, fluent readers, are building up that area. Now, you cannot build up that word form area without first being able to correctly sound the words out, and repeatedly over time, they become familiar. Basically, you can't build up that word form area except by first building up the phonological processing area, right? There's not like a shortcut. And this idea that's been around in education of we'll just teach kids sight reading. We'll just teach them how to, basically recognize words. You could do that for a few words, but as I said, there's too many words, and you're setting the child up for failure. You really have to go through the phonological route to get to that next route. Okay. And finally, the third main kind of dyslexia is really just a combination of the first two. So some people have underprocessing in both that red area of the brain slide and the green area, not just one or the other, but both. So it's kind of both barrels now. And as a result, that is where you have some of the most impaired, as you would imagine. Dyslexia, where, so for example, in phonological dyslexia, the child can't really sound the words out letter by letter. They're going to try to over-rely on just trying to recognize the whole word. So you'll get errors like the kid will read the word coin, C-O-I-N, and they may say corn, C-O-R-N, because they're 4 letters. They start and end in the same letters. They look alike. So they may mistake that. With orthographic dyslexia, the kid can sound out, but he's not recognizing whole words. Reading stays very slow and laborious. And the other thing is that they can read words that you sound out that are what we call phonetically regular. Each letter makes the sound that it's supposed to. But of course, in the English language, there's many, many words that are irregular. Kernel is a great example. Mm-hmm. C-O-L-O-N-E-L is the kernel. Words that are irregular, kids with orthographic dyslexia have a lot of trouble reading because that does rely on being able to recognize the sight, not an over-reliance on phonics, which is the part of their brain that's working better. So you get those errors. The person with mixed dyslexia, they don't really have, sort of the idea if you're going to catch and someone says you can't use your left hand, you use your right, or vice versa. With mixed, it's sort of like I take both your hands and tie it behind your back and say catch. You can try to catch with your feet, but it's going to be much more difficult and that's kind of what. So there's that. Those are the three main types of dyslexia. But again, about 80 to 85% have either phonological or the mixed type. Orthographic alone is probably 10 to 15%.
Okay. So I've heard that, I've heard mixed things about when you can diagnose dyslexia, that it can't be diagnosed until a certain age. Do you have any comment on that?
Yes. Well, generally, phonological processing skills, I mentioned, that they should develop sort of normally in children over time as they learn language auditorily and by listening. And most of the tests that have norms that you can compare where a child should be, are they average, above, below average for their age? Most of the tests of phonological processing start around 6 years old. Maybe you'll get some that start around 5, but around 6. Now, here's the thing. Some would argue that you can't really diagnose a child as having dyslexia, trouble with reading, until they've been taught to read. How do you know if they have a disorder that stops them from learning to read unless they've been taught? And of course, a lot of kids only begin learning to read at 6 or 7. So if a child's having trouble, you say, well, it's not like they've had years and years of experience. They're beginning readers. So a lot of people will say, let's wait. We really don't know yet. How far behind can a first grader be in reading? But here's the thing. Since we now know that the problems are usually based on phonological processing or some of these other things, and we can measure that even without the child being able to read, like that slide with the boxes on where they don't have to know letters yet. You can just say, if that's it, and use a colored block, and that's k, and use a colored block, you can test their phonological awareness at 5 or 6. And if a child is showing, for their age, major problems with this, even if they barely gotten any instruction, they're certainly at risk. I mean, some, myself included, might diagnose dyslexia, but at the very least, you'd say this is a child who's at great risk. And since we know that early intervention makes all the difference, you definitely can and should start looking for these skills in children by, no later than 6 years of age.
So basically, you can identify if there are any potential issues and if they are at risk, and then also inform parents and teachers on what then the signs to look for as they start to learn to read, as they, progress with their learning. So what are some of the early signs that you would see in younger children that might indicate a diagnosis of dyslexia?
And that's a great question, and particularly because you want to be on the lookout, because there are signs beyond just the child is having trouble with reading, particularly, as I said, when they're very young and they haven't had a ton of direct instruction. So some of the things you want to look for, and by the way, no one or two of these things is, oh my gosh, my child has dyslexia, right? But some of the things to look for are, as I said before, difficulty identifying the specific sounds or the number of sounds within words. Like, Sesame Street or some of the shows of can you hear rhymes? Can you hear which two words end in the same sound, right? So that would be a phonological processing issue. Difficulty learning the letters of the alphabet, and of course connecting them to their respective sounds. You'll also get issues where if a child gets a bit older and there's writing or spelling, the spelling is always harder than reading. At least there's something, you can make some kind of a guess, there's something to work with, but spelling is a blank piece of paper, and you have to figure out all the letters. So in someone with dyslexia, spelling is always worse than their reading. So you'll get lots of spelling errors, even the simple words, and a lot of times different misspellings of the same word if the child is using it, again and again. You'll get problems with sequencing of letters or best guesses. So they'll read was as saw or left as felt. Again, guessing words. And a lot of times, and this can be a strategy that can be used in learning to read, but it should not be the main strategy you're using, which is using contextual clues. If there's pictures or what other words in the story are saying. So one thing you'll get is they'll look at a word and they'll say a different word, which interestingly enough is like a synonym. It's in the same word class, but it's not the word that was on the paper. So they'll see the word mother, they may say father or parent. They'll see the word home, and they might say, as they're reading aloud, house. They may see the word huge and say big, or tornado, and they'll say volcano. Right? So, pardon? Well, the best guess is to some degree, yes, and then difficulty with, as I said, rhyming. So these are, things that you can be on the lookout for. The other thing you'll get is, because of the phonological processing problems, even with oral language, you'll get what are called spoonerisms. So they're cute when little kids do it, but like instead of saying fish and chips, they'll say shish and pips, or the child who will say paschetti instead of spaghetti. Now, again, in young children, particularly, under 5, don't worry about that. That happens. Those are really cute stories. They used to say, call it paschetti. But as the child gets to be, 6 and older, if they're still malapropisms, as they call it, if they're still mispronouncing these words, it can be an indication of, wait, you're unclear of what the sounds in the word are, or what order the sounds are in. So those little cute things become less cute as the child gets older. And those are also obviously signs in a young child.
Are there any indirect signs that you can kind of...
Yeah, sure. There are plenty of them. One is, kind of makes sense, if a child at whatever age is highly avoidant and reluctant whenever it comes to reading, whether it's instructing them to read or telling them, to read for school or whatever, they want to avoid it. And maybe they don't say that the reason is because they're not good at it, but you just notice that they have a lot of resistance to anything involving reading. Another thing is that, interestingly, a lot of children and teenagers who have dyslexia, they also have trouble memorizing certain, what we call automatic sequences, rote sequences. Recite the alphabet all the way from A to Z without making a mistake. Usually people can do that, but sometimes not. The days of the week in order, and particularly, and even in teenagers, I see this all the time, the months of the year. Just rattle them off, January through December. And you'd be amazed how many times, and they'll say, I was never sure of this. Similarly, memorizing their math facts. A lot of people with dyslexia can have a strength in math. And so, but Charles Schwab, for example, has dyslexia, and he's made his fortune except for math and taxes and such. But the one thing that people with dyslexia, even if they're good at math, will have trouble often is memorizing their math facts. Just those basic math tables, addition tables, subtraction tables, multiplication tables. What's 6 times 8? 48. Just knowing it quickly, fluently. Now you may say that's math, but that often happens with dyslexia, and it's worth looking at. And the other thing, of course, is if a child is good at calculation, but they're not as good at word problems because they're word problems and they have to read the word problem to solve it, that kind of distinction in how they are at math. The child only reads for information when they're forced to. They would never think to read for pleasure because there is no pleasure in reading for them. Listening comprehension is quite good, but reading comprehension is quite poor. Right? So you say, well, it's not just that the child doesn't understand language. Their listening comprehension is great. And, well, garbage in, garbage out, so to speak, if that could be a clue. They have more difficulty in school in more language-based subjects, English, history, but they're better, let's say, in science and math, right? There can be slower in developing motor skills because the motor strips of the brain are next to some areas of the brain that are needed also in reading. So it can be sort of an adjacent area is slightly out of whack. And of course, probably the best clue is if there's a family history, parent, a sibling, a close, relative, aunt, uncle, first cousin. These things are highly genetic. And so if you say, oh, yeah, their cousin or aunt so-and-so, or I had trouble reading when I was a kid, that's worth considering because, again, there's a lot in the genes.
Sure. So for someone with dyslexia, I know there are a lot of different interventions and resources, but is dyslexia something that can be, I don't know if I'm using the right word, reversed?
Well, yeah, no, yes. In fact, if we quickly go to, let's see, I guess it would be slide number 5. Let me just show you something. This was a very, very exciting finding by Sally Shaywitz, who's a very significant researcher in reading, and this comes from her work. So there, what you see is you have a picture of the brain as if you could imagine as if it was sort of cut from back to front. You're looking down on the brain from a bird's eye view. Okay, and what we have there is that in quote normal non-impaired readers, when they put them in a brain scanning machine to look at what parts of the brain were lighting up and working when they were reading in the machine. Okay? What you see is these are the 3 main areas. Broca's area, which I won't really get into, it's more about motor, moving the lips and kind of reading aloud. But you see the area 2 areas that are lit up the most, the amount that they're lit up is sort of corresponds to how much activity is going on in that part of the brain, is this part, which is the phonological processing part, and this part, which is the orthographic visual recognition word form part. So
just to jump in real quick. So this is referring back to that other brain slide that we have. So the red area is for those with the first type of dyslexia that you mentioned. And then the green area is that word form area. So that's the difficulty understanding. Okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yes. So in a non-impaired reader, you see that in particular, these 2 parts of the brain are both working, in a normal fashion, and they're reading fine. But when you put people with dyslexia in the brain scanning machine and had them read, what it showed was you had virtually no activity in these parts of the brain, right? Look, you can see it's not there. And of course, now the brain tries to compensate, sort of trying to catch with your feet, as I said before. So what you'll notice there is that on the impaired reading part of the brain, actually, if we can just get that back up for one more moment, you'll see that this Broca's area, which is just slightly activated, normal reader, is significantly activated, not on just the left side of the brain, but the right too. And what would be the word form area is now activated, but on the right side of the brain. It's basically a part of the brain that that visually recognizes objects, not words. So again, the brain is doing its best to compensate, sort of catching with its feet if the hands aren't available, so to speak. But this shows the wrong parts of the brain are trying to do the job. Now, very quickly, if you go to the next slide, once these people in the machine, the dyslexic people, were given a year of remediation and training in phonological awareness and all the rest, and they rescanned their brains a year later, look what you see. It looks pretty normal, right? It looks like the now you can see it's a little smaller. There's a little bit less activity in these 2 areas, the phonological and red, the word processing, but they've been basically changed from dormant and not working to they're online and working, and that corresponds to these kids and are now readers. But the really exciting part was that it was evidence that we're really rewiring the brain. We're literally changing how the brain works and what connections are being made, and that was very exciting, and particularly if you can get someone at a younger age. So that was so yes, we literally can, as you said, sort of reverse or the process, particularly if we get kids at as I said, elementary school is best. Any age you can help somebody, definitely, but elementary school, maybe beginning of middle school at the latest, to really get in there and do that. And
that's fascinating. I have a question. So for the impaired, I don't like saying that, the brain that showed dyslexia, when it had the two blue, so they're overcompensating. Your brain is overcompensating for what it is not able to do, right? So it's an over reliance on what then? Like, what is that blue part of the brain? What does that look for? It's relying on what?
The parts of, and if maybe we can get that back up, it'll be easier to sort of refer to it again. But that in the, actually the previous slide, if you would. Thank you. In the dyslexic brain, and you see the blue areas that are very activated on both right and left, this would be on the left side, it would be an area called Broca's area, and it's involved in motor aspects of speech. When people learn to read at first, even as they start to read silently, because of course first they read out loud, young children, and then they kind of learn to keep it in their head and read silently. But when they first learn to read silently, you'll watch their mouths are moving. There's a link between learning the sounds and everything and also learning what the mouth and tongue and jaw are doing. That can fade out over time, but they find even in strong readers, it's not enough to actually make their mouth move, but you'll find small amounts of activity, that part of the brain is sort of coming along for the ride anyway. So, but for a strong reader who's reading silently, it's sort of a vestige of when they learn to read. That's not really going to help them so much. So when you've got that being extra active, and then the right side of the brain says, and I'll come along, I'll help, I'll pitch in. It's like, but you're not involved in that at all. So again, thanks for trying, but you're not trained in the skills. And then again, on the right side, in the back, that kind of green area, that on the right side of the brain, that's a visual portion of the brain that recognizes either faces or objects. But on the left side of the brain is where, over time, development, evolution, that part of the brain was originally designed to recognize objects too. But when we designed reading, that part of the brain got co-opted. That part of the brain actually started to become specialized for recognizing letters and words. It changed as we had to make room in the brain for this new skill. And that's the area. But when you're using the other area, you're trying to learn to recognize words like you recognize objects. And there's just too many words to visually memorize all of them.
That was great. Thank you so much for that. I actually do have a question on our feed. If a child has both phonological processing and orthographic processing difficulties, is one sometimes a bigger problem than the other?
Generally speaking, the phonological processing is likely to be the bigger problem, in that probably the reason why they didn't develop the orthographic, the visual recognition, is again because you sort of have to go through sounding out again and again to get familiar. So if you have a child with both, and people are tempted to say, let's just cut the work in half. Let's just teach them to recognize words, and then we don't have to do this whole sounding out thing. And again, no, there's no free lunch. You can't bypass that process. So if you work on phonological, what you'll find is, by virtue of that, through recognition getting stronger, the orthographic visual recognition will start to improve as a function of that. But it can look like that the bigger problem as the child reads, it can look like the bigger problem is visual recognition of words, because they're just making all these guesses and they're not sure. And I think that's why people originally thought that it's a visual thing. because on the surface, that's what I call it, surface dyslexia. On the surface, it looks like it's a visual thing, but it's really not. And I'm just going to take about 15 seconds since we're here. This whole idea of reading backwards, and people will say, well, you're saying it's not about seeing or reading things backwards, but my child has dyslexia and they do that. And yes, but that can happen. It's usually not anything like the main issue of dyslexia, but in terms of people being concerned, it's developmentally normal for a child to read backwards or even write backwards from right to left, okay, up until about 6 years old. By 6, and definitely by 7, that should really be fading out. And this slide that was just put up is this. If you look at those pictures on top, of course you recognize what they are, right? Very familiar. What you might not notice is that they're backwards. Right? And that's because for objects like that that green on the right side of the brain that's trying to compensate for objects, we need to be able to recognize things even if they're reversed or at a different angle than we first saw them. You know, we can't say that's a quarter, and then if you turn it 45 degrees, we say, what is that? You know, we have to be able to object permanence. So these things are reversed, and most people, if I didn't tell you, would never know. The brain just compensates, I recognize. Well, similarly, that will happen at a young age for letters, but that left part of the brain will mature out of that. And this, again, by around 6, definitely by 7, those reversals should be stopped. But when people come and say, my 5-year-old is learning and they're writing backwards, oh no, it's probably normal, you know, at that age. Or at least I wouldn't worry about if that's the only symptom you're seeing.
Gotcha. So I guess when we were a long time ago, our brains were meant to recognize people and objects, and then we threw in an alphabet and a whole language, and it just changed some parts of the brain.
It did. The brain got rewired, and with people with dyslexia, there's just some problems with that wiring, but those problems can often be corrected. And I'll just say, it's kind of a natural segue. Well, what are, some of the ways to do that? And I guess on slide 10, I think, is just a list of a number of some of the better and more common programs that are used in schools and special education, etc. Now, this is not a comprehensive list. It's not that if a program is not on this list, it's not a good program, don't use it. There's many good programs, but these are, in my experience, they're definitely scientific and empirically proven, and that's important because there's so many people on the internet saying this thing works. It has to be put under scientific scrutiny and prove that it works. These all have that proof to them. The gold standard is what they call the Orton-Gillingham method, and there's a lot of programs like the Wilson Reading System and Reading 180, which I know Montgomery County Public Schools used to use and probably still do, that are, quote, Orton-Gillingham based systems. And if you or your child or whatever is working and they say this is an Orton-Gillingham based reading program, that's a good sign. That's the gold standard. Now, there are other programs that are not necessarily Orton-Gillingham based, but they've been proven to work very well. And they're on that list as well. The LIPS program, of which that test with the blocks that I showed you comes out of that program, is very, very strong in terms of obviously phonological processing, learning the sounds and syllables, is very phonologically based reading program. But you also have something I want to call attention to, which is the phonographics program, which is really good even for a kid who's maybe had some of the phonological training. What I find is the kids who've had remediation, they become readers, and that's wonderful. But so much of the emphasis is on phonological awareness, as it should be. But the point is, now they can read and they can sound out. But if a child is older, they're in middle school or high school, they can read, but they're reading slowly. They're sounding everything out. Try getting through all that homework when you read that way. And a lot of times, I'm finding anyway, Not enough emphasis is then put on the second half of good. Now we've gone through the phonological method. Now we can get to building up the orthographic, the visual recognition of words. A lot of times, like, you can read success and we're done. But they're slow readers. It's too much work. They don't want to read. So the phonographics program is a great program for the kid who maybe has learned their phonological processing, but it's really based on recognizing the letter blends and the parts of words, the prefixes, the suffixes. They call them word sound pictures. Letters are sound pictures, and it's very good for getting that kind of fluency. And finally, another one that really also not only stresses the phonological processing, but the orthographic and so many other things, is this program by Mary and Wolf out in Boston, the RAVE-O program. And that's an acronym for retrieval and automaticity and vocabulary engagement and orthography. That's the O. And that's also been found, particularly for younger kids, to be a very good program that really covers all of those angles as well. So any of the programs listed here, you're in good shape, and these really do help fix things, so to speak.
Thank you so much. That's such a great list. I think that's a great point that you mentioned also about once someone has learned to read, they're still sounding out each letter though, right? So for example, the word you showed earlier, transferable. If someone has learned the sounds that go with the letters, are they still sounding it out as t-r-s versus grouping it together? Okay.
Yeah,
that's
right.
The second piece. Gotcha.
So that might be, for example, I mean, transferable is a higher level word, so we'd probably be looking at a middle school student at least. But the point is, if they were reading transferable and they were going you'd say that it might be the orthographic dyslexia, either because that part, isn't working because it just hasn't had enough experience in recognizing, or for other reasons. Because at that age, they should just be, their eyes should just go to the parts of the word that say, I recognize that as a meaningful unit. So transferable. And, as an analogy or metaphor, actually, when I was younger, it just seemed like buildings took an awfully long time, much longer now they do today, to get out to build. And it seemed like they were just building it, plank by plank or whatever. And now it seems like I drive by and I say, oh, look, they're building a new building here. And literally the next week, it's like they're practically done with the frame. I'm like, how did... But then I saw that they're doing it differently now. They're having like an entire wall of the windows and everything, and it's kind of pre-built. And they have a crane, and they sort of lift the whole thing, and they slap it on, like they kind of built it somewhere else. By the time it gets to the actual work site, there's a lot that's already been pre-assembled, and they kind of slap it together in a lot less pieces rather than plank by plank, brick by brick. Well, I thought to myself, that's kind of like what happens. The plank by plank, brick by brick is sounding it out, and the pre-assembled and slap it together quick and it's done is the orthographic. And that's what we have to learn to do.
Great metaphor. I agree. Those buildings are going up pretty quickly all over. I guess I just have one last thing before we go. This has been a lot of information, but what is something that is not necessarily helpful to say to someone with dyslexia? Like, just keep sounding it out, or, I feel like there's just some things that we say that might not be good. I don't know if you had any insight on that.
Well, yeah. I mean, sure. I mean, sound it out. If a person can't do it, and you start to see over time, I mean, at first you say sound it out. But if you see that, it's like, how, or I can't, then asking someone to do something that they can't do is kind of silly and a little bit, cruel, isn't it? So when you see that they're having trouble with this, and that's one of the issues that's what a learning disability is. And as I said earlier, people who have intellectual challenges, of course, can have learning disabilities too. But generally speaking, there is no intellectual cognitive problem. So people say, does this mean I'm or my kid isn't smart? No, in fact, in some ways, you have at least average or well above average intelligence. You should, by all accounts, be able to do this, but there's something there that's getting in the way. So just realize it's this specific weakness we have to build rather than saying, try it again, try it again. You should be able to do this. This is ridiculous. Come on. Look harder is one.
Yeah.
Look, I'm not sure what that means really. I don't know how to look harder. But that's another one that I'm not crazy about.
Well, thank you. I think it's nice to point out that, yeah, absolutely. It's just a processing, and there are so many tools out there. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing your information with us. You're brilliant. You've done this for many, many years, and I'm sure that you helped so many families.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I appreciate you having me.
All right, great. So for any of those in the comments that we didn't really get to, we will be sure to, comment after the fact. And, if you're viewing this after the fact, feel free to continue to ask your questions, and we'll do our best to respond to everyone. But thanks again for joining us, and we hope that you got something out of it.
Bye-bye. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.